everyone. Hello and welcome to the first lecture in 2025. It's lovely to see you all here today. And we have a very special guest, and that is Stephanie Holt. She is a woman who wears many, many hats. And she is a naturalist, she's an ecologist, she knows a lot about bats and moths, and all sorts of ecological phenomena that are UK-based. And she knows that because one of her hats is working for the Natural History Museum in London. But the other hat is doing a doctorate at the History Department on Gilbert White. And Steph is also so accomplished that I actually had to list in my little notebook all the wonderful things that she's been doing. So she's a trustee of the British Naturalist Association, and she's an associate editor of the Archives of Natural History. She's a fellow of the Linnaean Society. She has recently been awarded the David Bellamy Award for Exceptional Field Naturalist by the British Naturalist Association. And if you follow her on any social media, you would know that Steph is giving a talk like, I don't know, every other day it seems. And each of these talks seems to be slightly different, and all of them seem to be equally fascinating. So today we're very lucky that she has spared us the evening, and we will find out about Gilbert White's take on mammals. So please give a very warm welcome to Steph Holt.
Thanks, Joanna. It's great to be here. I've been to a couple of the Mammals Society talks here in the past, but I haven't been to one for a while, so it's rather lovely to be here and stood up in front of all of you, even if it's slightly scary standing on the lecture stage at the Natural History Museum in Oxford. So yes, as Joanna says, one of the things that I've been studying for the last few years has been Gilbert White. And particularly looking at some slightly different aspects to the naturalist of Selborne that you might or might not know him as. Can I get a quick show of hands? Who has heard of Gilbert White? Excellent. Brilliant. Good. I'm so pleased. Because there are some audiences where I walk into and who? Why are you wittering on about this 18th century natural historian? So I'm so pleased we've got an audience of Gilbert White fans. I am going to start us off with a bit of an introduction to White, though, and some of my research as well that I've been doing over the last couple of years. As Joanna said, I've been sort of transitioning from scientific research into historical research and trying to find some sort of strange sweet spot in between the two. I still work at the Natural History Museum part-time for the Centre for UK Nature, and as Joanna said, my initial specialism was bats. I've been studying bats since I was 12 years old, so I've spent an awful lot of time falling over things in the dark and with sparks making a lot of strange noises. But increasingly I've become more and more fascinated by where our actual studies of natural history really come from. So I'm now working part-time at the museum and full-time doing a doctorate because sleeping is not something that I need to do, apparently. I'm also going to make a slight apology. My asthma is terrible at the moment with the sort of cold and central heating and all the rest of it. So if I cough or sound a little bit croaky, I really apologise. You'll have to forgive me. There we go. So there's Gilbert, keeping an eye on us via the medium of the lovely mannequin that is in the Gilbert White Museum. But this is Gilbert White, the naturalist of Selborne, as so many people think of him. Gilbert White was born in 1720 in a little village called Selborne in Alton, near Alton in the county of Hampshire. And it's from Selborne that we really think of Gilbert White. Gilbert was initially, throughout his lifetime, a religious man. He was a theologian. He studied here in Oxford, and we'll look at that in a little bit more depth, because he's best known for these detailed, meticulous studies of the natural world and of antiquities as well, for those of you who've read the second half of the book. You see one nod, at least. He also studied the antiquities. He was passionate about Selborne, his local environment, and in his words of observing narrowly the landscape, the wildlife, the people, and the history around him, something which so many of us find so inspirational still today. I just wanted to point out as well, that picture isn't actually fuzzy. It's made up of a mosaic. It's built up of tiles from our digitised collections at the Natural History Museum. So if you look very, very carefully, you can see all of our British specimens tucked away in there. To give you an idea of location, the arrow, which hopefully you can see here, points towards Selborne. Obviously, we are up here in Oxford. And London, which we'll come back to in a minute, is obviously off over on the right. But so that's to give us an idea of where we're talking about, a very rural part of the world, and actually for White and anyone travelling to visit White, pretty hard to get to in the winter. Certainly White would have struggled to get out of Selborne at this time of year. The village he grew up in, well, this is the frontispiece from, the fold-out frontispiece from the first edition of the Natural History of Selborne. And it's an image I absolutely love because there are so many things you can see within this picture which both describe Selborne, tells a bit more about White and a little bit more than most people would think of, but also are so visible today if you ever get the chance to go down to Hampshire. The view is taken from a part of the hillside called the Short Live. Unfortunately today you can't stand there and see this view anymore, which is a real shame. It's covered in woodland now. But it looks back towards the village of Selborne. This is the church, St Mary's, where Gilbert was the curate 3 times, and it's also where he's buried today. You can just about see the zigzag footpath. Has anyone been to Hampshire and to Gilbert White's house? Excellent. Have you managed to make it up the zigzag path? Yes? Did you get halfway up and go, this is really long? This is the zigzag path, not cut by Gilbert, but by his younger brother John. And then the Wakes, Gilbert White's house and home, is just here as well. So we can see all of Selborne within this image. What Gilbert is portraying by using this image as the frontispiece is he's going, this is my village. You can see everything that I'm talking about within this image. But also it's telling you quite a lot about him. He likes having people around. He likes parties, he likes it when he has visitors coming down to see him so he can show people the wonder of this place that he called home. I can't guarantee that that's Gilbert climbing the hill, but I do kind of think that it is, the way that he's espousing it. Come on, look at this, it's brilliant. I do kind of hope that that is him. Because it would give us, unusually, an image of Gilbert that we will come back to. One of the reasons that I think that Gilbert was so fascinated about natural history within Selborne is actually because of the complexity of the geology that lies underneath the area. We've got chalk patches there, places that are quite well known, like Nor Hill. If you've been in that area, very well known for its orchids and for its butterflies. You've got River Valley, you've got steep-sided woodlands, you've got acidic communities, you've got neutral communities, all in a very small patch. And that, for a naturalist, of course, is such a fantastic boon because you're seeing all these little habitat changes happening in a very small area. Gilbert did travel around his home quite a lot. He had a little grey pony called Mouse that he was frequently out riding on. He named his animals the cutest names. His dog was called Fairy Queen, which I absolutely love. He bought that at Blenheim. So he would be riding around, going from church to church or from village to village and crossing all of these habitat boundaries, seeing this dense mosaic of habitats. And of course it's plants and habitats that they sit within that first attracted Gilbert White to natural history, like so many naturalists, particularly this period, but today as much as then. Gilbert's garden, and this beautiful illustration was done for the Gilbert House Museum, shows the reconstruction of Gilbert's garden that's been done at that museum, but it also shows very intensely what Gilbert was trying to create in the patch of land that he had control on. He had his flower gardens, he had his organised beds where he could grow new species and try out new things. He had his vegetable patch, of course, that he's so well known for, where he would have grown melons using hotbed techniques and things like that, and where he was so passionate about new ways of growing different types of fruit and vegetable in his garden. He had his slightly strange seating arrangements, like the rotating port barrel seat, which I figure you can only come up with once you've got to the bottom of the barrel of port. But it is quite a nice view, if nothing else, of the wider meadow behind him. And it's this meadow as well where we hear Gilbert talking about wandering through his gardens and the meadows around his house. And we see encapsulated within the poem that he wrote to his correspondent, Thomas Pennant, the Welsh naturalist, travel writer and antiquarian, the letters to whom form the first half of the natural history section of Gilbert White's book. It's here we see the naturalist's summer evening walk poem being enacted in reality. But we always think about Gilbert White in Selborne. Indeed, there are books called Gilbert White in His Village, White Selborne, White in Selborne, things like that. There are literally so many books written describing White only as an older gentleman, something of a recluse within his village of Selborne, not really travelling, not really exploring anywhere else. And of course, in Gilbert White's terms, he was observing his local area narrowly. But Gilbert's family didn't actually come from Hampshire at all. They came from Oxfordshire. He's a local boy, to an extent at least. Gilbert himself was born in Selborne, but this is his father at the bottom here. This is John White, born also in Selborne in 1688. John was quite an interesting chap because he does nothing very much. He qualifies as a barrister, and then he marries a minor heiress and retires immediately and has a very lovely life where he plays the harpsichord and rides his pony around and has nice chats with everybody, and everyone seems to love him, but he doesn't seem to do very much. So he's very nice, and we're all very sad when he dies, but yes, he's just happy, which is wonderful, I think, actually. But Gilbert's grandfather, also Gilbert White, and this is where the family gets really complicated because there is a certain point in this talk where I'm going to have to use the words Benjamin White 4 times in one sentence, and they're all different ones. But this is Gilbert White Sr., the Reverend Gilbert White, born in 1650 in Oxford. So he's from right here. He went to Magdalen College, and through being part of Magdalen College, he became the Vicar of Selborne. So it's at this point that the White family moved from Oxford to Selborne. And the connections back to Oxford go even further back to Gilbert White's great-grandfather, Sir Sampson White, born in 1606 in Witney, just outside the city, who moved into Oxford itself in 1641. He was a student and fellow himself of Magdalen College and was twice Mayor of Oxford. Now, you'll notice one particular fact. He was knighted in 1661. Can you guess by whom? Yes. He was knighted for services to the restored king because the Mayor of Oxford acts as the butler during coronation ceremonies. So he was knighted for that. So you can find the chalice he was gifted with for his services during the coronation. That's in the Museum of Oxford. And also, his tombstone, if you go into the back doors of the University Church and you look very awkwardly at the memorial stone that's above the till, which does mean you have to explain yourself to the poor checkout person what you're doing. That's actually the tombstone to several members of Gilbert White's family, including Sir Sampson White. So he's something of a local boy. Gilbert himself came to Oxford as well. He was accepted as a commoner in December 1739. Now, unfortunately, he didn't actually arrive in Oxford until April of the following year because his mother, Anne, died at the start of December from measles. So as the eldest son, he had to be at home and looking after the family and things like that as well. But he matriculated to Oriel rather than Magdalen. I've spoken to lots of people about that, and we're not quite sure why. So if anyone's got a clue, I'd be more than happy to talk to you about it. And he graduated on the 30th of June, 1743. On his graduation, he was gifted this copy of Homer's Iliad, the translation by Pope, and he was presented it by Alexander Pope, who was at that point quite elderly. It was only, I think, a few months before he died. But that book is really, really important because within those pages is this. This is the only, well actually there's two of them, the other one's terrible, and they're both in the same book, but this is the only image that we know of certainly was done of Gilbert White while he was alive. So this is the only image we have of what Gilbert White looked like, scribbled by a friend with TC as the initials of the author of it. That's all we know of what Gilbert White looked like, beyond written descriptions. And that's the one that's been used to inspire the coloured version, which we used for the digitised version I showed you at the start. One thing that we do have and has been incredibly useful to me in my research has been Gilbert White's account books. His best friend John Mulso mentioned several times that he was very, very good at accounting because he had to be, because he was not a wealthy man particularly. Mulso mentions in one letter to him, you can make £10 go as far as I can 40. And he did this through really good accounting, but this of course tells us lots about him. It tells us what he was doing in Oxford for a start. He's going to the physic garden, the botanic garden. He's going to the church. He's going to the coffee house, he's buying things, he's buying fruit because presumably they had a scurvy issue at Oriel maybe. What's he doing? This is where he buys Fairy Queen, his dog. Oh sorry, Woodstock Turnpike. He's going to the carpenters, he's buying all manner of bits and pieces. Interesting for me because I also study the history of martial arts in the UK. He buys a dumbbell. It's not one single dumbbell, he's not just lifting weights on one arm. It's an actual dumbbell, it's a piece of exercise equipment. It tells us actually a bit about Oxford's living accommodation for its students, because you had to have it in the room above and a rope dangling down below, and you would pull it for exercise, presumably to keep you fit enough to ring bells when you went back home. We know a bit about Gilbert White's time in Oxford and what he was like as well, and his time here when he's a young man tells us so much more about White as a person and how people would actually come to the common rooms to listen to him talk. He's eloquent not just in his writing, he's eloquent in how he talks as well. And I personally think that's absolutely magnificent that we have quotes like this, contemporary accounts of what the man is like, not just the impression we have through his publication. This is a nice little bit of gossip. This is his best friend, John Mulso, and this is his sister, better known as the blue-stocking Heki Chapone. In 1750, Mulso writes to White and says, so you best know the meaning of your new name and whether it is a fond abbreviation of your Oxford title of Busser, because Chapone's, Mulso, as she would have then been called, had taken to calling him Wittibus. Busser being the 18th century slang for kisser. Might give you an indication that perhaps he wasn't always the retiring quiet gentleman of Selborne. But aside from the gossip, after graduation, Gilbert White took on fellowship in 1744 at Oriel. He became dean in 1752, junior proctor as well, and was very, very close to becoming provost of the college in 1757. It became quite a contentious issue, however, that he retained his fellowship. And this was because he was actually quite private. Even though he kept detailed records of his counts, he was a very private man. He started, therefore, to retreat back towards Selborne and start to explore the area around his original home. He first becomes curate at Selborne in 1751, and that's when he starts making his first records there. He produces his garden calendar, which is a record of what he's doing in his garden. He variously becomes curate in other locations around the area. He comes back to the curacy of Selborne in 1756, and then in 1758 his father dies. And this is where the controversy comes in, because everyone thought at the college that as the eldest son he had inherited a lot of money. He didn't. John had spent an entire life having a lovely time and frittering it all away. In fact, White didn't even inherit the house. It went to his uncle Charles first, and it's not until 1763, when his uncle dies, that he actually even owns the house that he's best known for living in. 1766, however, is a very important year, because this is when we see the start of White really as a naturalist. This is the garden calendar. It's inspired by Philip Miller and his Gardener's Dictionary, which was produced from where Philip Miller was the head gardener, which is the Chelsea Physic Garden, but also, I'm sure, by his visits to the Oxford Botanic Garden as well. But in 1765, he buys Hudson's Flora Anglica, And in 1766, at the start of the year, he starts his own Flora Selborniensis. But you'll notice what's happened here. You can read his handwriting. It might be tricky for those of you at the back. So it reads, the Flora Selborniensis, with some coincidence of the coming and departure of birds of passage, insects, the appearance of reptiles, and basically he just starts to record everything. In our terms as naturalists, we could perhaps consider him as something of a pan-species lister, really. And we also see as well the books that he's using to help him to identify these things, including, for us as mammalogists, Ray's Synopsis Animalia Quadrupedea. Now, my research on White over the last few years has really centred on looking at Gilbert beyond his village. This is Selborne down here. This is Oxford up here. They know he travelled back. He travelled to see various relations, which are these dots here, 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 some quite a few in London, up here and up here. He never quite made it up to these most northern territories. Unfortunately, he suffered from very, very bad coach sickness and once suggested to his correspondent Thomas Pennant that he might die if he travelled all the way to Flintshire. I've been focusing on him in London, where we get biological records. But the reason he's spending so much time in London is through his brother, well, two of his brothers, particularly Benjamin. Benjamin's the publisher who eventually produces his Natural History of Selborne via his Fleet Street publication house at the sign of Horace's Head. And this location is incredibly important because the location is 63 Fleet Street. Crane Court is the then home of the Royal Society. It's a natural history specialist bookshop right outside the headquarters of the Royal Society. Everybody's going to come past that. They're going to be drinking coffee, they're going to be having a chat, they're going to be looking at the latest books, sorting out their book contracts. This is the sort of place that meetings happen. And it's here that he meets his two main correspondents, Thomas Pennant and Dane Farrington, who we know from the book, alongside the rest of his network. And this is my starting attempt at Gilbert White's network in London. We can pull together extra information from his receipts. We literally have packets of his receipts. And altogether, they pulled together a map of Gilbert White in London and his different activities there, from preaching at churches to shopping to visiting other botanic gardens and other naturalists as well. White started his naturalist journal in 1768 and he ran it through to the end of his life, recording, as we all do, the natural history of the world around him. And he was unique, really. This is where we start to think of White as the father of ecology, because he's doing exactly what we do. He was initially reluctant to publish, as we can see from this quote to Daines Barrington, but it's Barrington, his connection from London, who really inspired him to start thinking about publication. And it's through Barrington that he was able to get his first route to publication, which was via a letter, which turned into two letters, read and then published by the Royal Society in the Philosophical Transactions of the Society. One of the letters, as you can see from the link here, is available on the Royal Society's Turning the Pages website. Now, it's not a mammal, I'm afraid. They're all on swifts and swallows and house martins. But they give that first tentative link into, might someone be interested in reading about what I'm finding out? Oops, I think I've just jumped there we go. So what White does on starting to realise that actually people might be interested in his findings is he starts to think about how might I pull a book together, and he recalls his letters from Pennant and from Barrington and starts to rewrite them into the book that we know today. For those of you who haven't read it or haven't read it for a while, the book is written as a series of letters from Gilbert to two of his correspondents, Thomas Pennant and Daines Barrington. The letters give various accounts of the comings and goings of wildlife and plants and other activities as well. And then the antiquities section delves further into the history and nature of Selborne too. But the letters aren't as originally written. The letters have been changed and translated so that they're suitable for a wider readership. Things which don't relate to Selborne aren't in there, things are changed around in time. And indeed, the first 9 letters of the book are entirely fictional, an introduction to Selborne anyway. The lady on the side here, this is Molly White, Gilbert's niece. She was really instrumental in helping him to edit and transcribe and rewrite the letters ready for publication by her father, Benjamin White, the publisher in London. That entire manuscript and all of its annotations and notes still exists in the Gilbert White house in Hampshire. The publication came out in print in 1789. This is the title page. The image here confuses quite a few people. It's the little imaginary hermitage that was built, or make-believe hermitage, that was built at the top of the zigzag path, where Henry White, the baby brother of the White siblings, dressed up as a little hermit to entertain the guests. So the elderly gentleman there is in fact Henry White with a big white beard and a big pointy hat, pretending to be a rubby little hermit for decorative purposes at the top of the hill. And you'll see here, hopefully you can just see, printed for B. White and Son, also Benjamin White, at Horace's Head, Fleet Street. Now, Gilbert White died on the 26th of June, 1793, and an anonymous entry in the Gentleman's Magazine on the 11th of July that year states, "A sigh escapes me on the demise of that most excellent man, accurate historian, diligent naturalist, and elegant writer, the Reverend Gilbert White." But White's story does not stop there. Don't worry, the mammals are coming. What we have is this incredible legacy of information. Now, I mentioned that the book was published in 1789. To date, it has never been out of print, and that itself is extraordinary in the wide legacy of publications that we have from that period. It's in fact the fourth longest constantly in print book in the English language, succeeded only by the King James Bible, the complete works of Shakespeare, and Bunyan's A Pilgrim's Progress. Everything else has been out of print for at least a little bit of time. It runs now to over 400 editions. It's been published in 7 different languages. It has inspired some of the greatest people in natural history. Charles Darwin even describes himself a pilgrimage, in his words, to the home of the naturalist of Selborne. And David Attenborough has talked about White many times. It's inspired books which have come out of it. This one of the most recent, looking at the art that has been inspired by the Natural History of Selborne. And of course, you can still pop to Blackwell's and buy a copy of it. Well, probably not today, actually, they're probably closed, but you can pop in tomorrow if you don't have one on your shelves. But what of Gilbert's Mammals? It's the mammal group, after all. Now, books have been written on Gilbert White in ornithology. They've specifically pulled out his expertise and his observations on migration of swifts and swallows, the behaviour of what he called the Caprimulgus, of course the nightjar or the goat sucker, as it was known at the time. They've pulled out things like the golden oriole that he records and tracing their movements and behaviour through his correspondence with Thomas Pennant further north, but also his brother John, who lived for 15 years in Gibraltar, acting as the chaplain on the island there. So he's best known for ornithology. He's probably secondarily known for his botany and his interest in plants, particularly plants coming in new to the British Isles. But in terms of mammals, he's also incredibly important. No apologies, that I'm going to start with bats. I'm sorry, they just are. But the 18th century marked a real step change in our understanding of bats. By the 1812 posthumously published edition of Thomas Pennant's British Zoology, and this is where Pennant is so important, because he's translating information from a whole suite of correspondence to build this extensive 4-volume work on British zoology. Note not British entomology. He didn't like insects very much. But within British zoology, in the 1812 edition, he was identifying 5 different species of bats. He had the common, that's the pipistrelles, the long-eared, the great bat, as you can see on the right here, the horseshoe, the barbastelle, and the minute bat, which is quite hard to trace. Like, within it, he's sort of describing something which is kind of an amalgamation of several different Myotis species. In 1767, September the 9th, White writes to Pennant that he knows of only 2 bats. So prior to 1812, White only had heard about 2 bats. The common, which he called Vespertilio murinus, and the Vespertilio oribus. So he knows the pipistrelle and the long-eared, essentially, in our terms. In the same letter, he describes meeting a tame bat, which would take flies from a person's hands. So someone in his family is keeping a pet bat, and you can hand it flies and pick them off your hand. And he also gives quite a whimsical description in the letter of its feeding habits, how it guards its feed by hunching over like a bird of prey with its wings, and how it took the wings off flies before eating out the squishy bit in the middle. He didn't use squishy. Interestingly, he notes that while it preferred insects, it would also take raw meat if that's what it was offered, and discusses that in his opinion this potentially corroborated the old wives' tale of bats gnawing at bacon being hung up in chimneys. He also describes how it runs, calling it grotesque and ridiculous, and notably saw it, in his words, confute the vulgar opinion that bats, when down on a flat surface, cannot get on the wing again by rising with great ease from the floor. He also notes that bats drink on the wing like swallows and play over streams and ponds to both drink and feed. And he describes a boat trip from Richmond to Sunbury where he saw a myriad of bats swarming along the Thames. No doubt unbeknownst to him, he was also seeing Dorbenton's bats in and amongst them. 2 years later, he's added to his observations, and he describes the great large bat, and that he sees it during the period of end of April through to July. He notes that at present it's a nondescript in England, but then he goes on to give a description of it, and that description is clearly a nocturnal bat, a species which wasn't named and described until 1774 by Johann Schreiber. White considers how similar their flight is to swifts and how they likely feed on similar species. And those of us who've been out studying and watching for bats early in the evening will, I'm sure, have also noticed that kind of shift change, just as the light starts to go, as the swifts all go off to bed and the nocturals come in at exactly the same height above the tree canopy. He's not able to acquire a specimen to look at until 1771, when he writes to Pennant in September that he shot 2 males. He notes how rare they are. Question about why you would shoot them in modern context, but, a bit of presentism for you there. But interesting proposes a name for them of Vespertilio altivolans, due to the height at which they feed. He gives a detailed description of the specimens, including describing a dissection that he's undertaken of them. And interestingly, he notes a peculiar structure in the ear that he did not understand perfectly, and refers it to the observation of a curious anatomist. Some mustelids. In 1768, White discusses a possible new species, mustelid, that he's been told about, beyond weasel, stoat, ferret and polecat, locally called a cane, and describes it as a little reddish beast, not much bigger than a field mouse, but much longer. Although he goes on to say that this piece of intelligence can be little depended on, but further inquiry should be made. Personally, I've not quite been able to resolve what he means in the description, so I've not quite got to the bottom of what he means there. When discussing the otter in 1770, he's continuing a conversation on fish-eating quadrupeds from a paragraph he's written previously about house cats. He notes how different cats are from other fish-eating quadrupeds, and that they are the only ones who he considers not to be amphibious. He describes a male otter being brought to him weighing 21 pounds, but note as well that at no point during that I haven't used the word mammal, because White doesn't use it. White is following his peers and referring to them only as quadrupeds. Pennant and Linnaeus do the same, and other contemporaries. However, Linnaeus had coined the term in 1758 as an English version of the Latin mammalis, or of the breast. Mammals in place of quadrupeds seems, from what I've been reading at least, others might find earlier examples, but it seems to come in more commonly in the 19th century. Moving on to other mammals. There are a number of mammals that White is clearly aware of, but he makes very little reference to, except in passing, because everyone knows what they look like, everyone knows what a rabbit is. In December 1769, he's discussing Pennant's British zoology and some changes that might be made to it. Some mammals he clearly knows well, and others he's a bit more surprised by. Rabbit records, I'm sure you probably have the same in Oxfordshire. They're so frequent that they're actually very rarely recorded. When I started working for the Hampshire Biodiversity Information Centre back in 2000, if you looked at our records then, the rabbit was extinct because there were no records, because they're everywhere, so no one records them. And White certainly is not immune to that sort of lack of recording because they're just everywhere. He mentions in an introduction as common and problematic, but that's about it and gives us no real detail. But he's clearly very interested in Pennant's description of the white hare of Scotland, which you can see in this illustration from British Zoology up here. He's very interested that they're proposed as a new species, but of course he's never going to see one in his lifetime because he's never going to be able to get anywhere near where they are. He's also interested in Pennant's reference to the water shrew being found for the first time in Lincolnshire. White knew it only from Buffon's work and therefore considered it only to be a continental species, so he was delighted to find it was a new one to add to the British mammal list. He goes on to describe as well an incident of a farmer accidentally excavating a water rat's burrow in a dry chalk field very far from water. He's able to describe the nest of grass and leaves and says that within it they found a winter stock of potatoes that the water rat had provisioned itself with to keep itself going. He is, like many who find the water vole far from water, confused by its terrestrial tendencies in certain circumstances and questions if it's a response to the oncoming winter. Elsewhere in his writing, he questions if there are two species of what we would now call water vole, the aquatic and the terrestrial. And this is a query that Linnaeus was also struggling with, proposing potentially a Arvicalia amphibius and an Arvicalia terrestris. And of course, that's a question which has dogged the taxonomy of the water vole for many, many years. It's interesting, though, I find that we get such a terrestrial description of the water vole from White's writing, when that more terrestrial behaviour typically seems to come from elsewhere in Europe and all the way over towards Russia as well, rather than the UK populations. Let's move us on to the harvest mouse. This is one of the most important of White's observations as far as mammals are concerned. The harvest mouse. It's an area where White made detailed studies and records which made a significant change to the 18th century understanding of mammals in Britain. Across a suite of letters to Pennant, and I'm referring here not to the published letters but to the original correspondence letters which I transcribed a couple of years ago. They're all in the British Library, most of them. But across these letters we find the discovery, observation and description of White's new mouse. Absent from British zoology at this point, it's not until White's descriptions, obviously encouraged with the letters from Pennant, which unfortunately don't exist anymore, that we find the harvest mouse finally starting to make an appearance. And Pennant then picks up on this new mouse of White's, and we start to find it included in later editions of British zoology. White first mentions his new mouse in August 1767, and importantly for my research looking at White beyond Selborne, this contains the only conclusive proof that Pennant and White did meet in person. As White says in this letter, I had no opportunity of procuring any of those mice which I mentioned to you in town, so they did meet in London. He does note, however, that the person he's been talking with mentions that they are most prolific during harvest. So he's been speaking to local farmers and countrymen around Selborne, and they're saying that they see loads of them in harvest. It's not until January of the following year that we find White's letters returning to the harvest mouse once again. Here we've got the first description of their nests amidst the straws of the standing corn above the ground, and their hibernation in beds of grass at ground level. He does make a mistake, though, in suggesting that their rendezvous is in the corn ricks, but of course this is where they are taken to at harvest. It's not exactly a consensual migration on the mouse's part. He weighs the ones that he catches and finds that he needs two to weigh the same amount as just 1/2 copper penny, and suggests that they're probably the smallest quadrupeds in these islands. A fully grown house mouse weighing 6 times as much. By the end of March, he's acquired himself some good specimens of his new mice, and in this instance proposes a name. And this is one of the very few attempts at naming that we get from him. He says, Linnaeus perhaps would call the species Mus minimus. Unfortunately, he doesn't get the official naming for this, because it's no true naming event. Although the letter was written in 1768, it wasn't published until 1789 in the final book, by which time Peter Pallas, the Prussian zoologist, best known, of course, for the Pallas cat, had published a description and proposed a name of Micromus minitus in 1771. Now, this might be a little bit of a surprise for the naturalist of Selborne. The moose might not be a species that you might first associate with Gilbert White. Of course, it's not a species that you find wandering around the hills of Hampshire. But White does mention deer of Hampshire as a hunted species and their presence in the environs of Selborne in his introduction. But the moose does stand out in the natural history as an oddity. He relates in a letter to Thomas Pennant, so it's letter 28, for those of you who are sat there keenly flicking through your copies, of course, that on Michaelmas Day he was able to view the female moose that had belonged to the Duke of Richmond of Goodwood. But unfortunately it had died the morning before, so he was only able to examine the carcass, which is slung up by straps around its belly inside an old greenhouse. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to record information for long because it was starting to go putrid and he couldn't stand the smell. But while he was there, he did take various measurements, as many as he could, and he makes comparison to both British deer species and to horses, and at one point, similarities to donkeys and things like that. He remarks on the length of its legs and the shortness of its neck, and he remarks, of course, on the size of its nostrils, which are really quite dramatic in this illustration of British zoology. He also discusses that although the female was dead, he was shown a set of antlers from the male, which of course you can see rather dramatically illustrated here, and he inquires of Pennant if he thinks the American moose and the European elk might be the same creature. What's notable here is that although he mentions the comparison to deer, he doesn't mention one of his very odd observations, whereby in deer he is convinced that the preorbital gland just below the eye is an additional set of nostrils so that they can breathe while they're drinking water. The moose is the only non-UK mammal species that we see White talking about in his letters, which is something of a surprise and highlights the constant frustration of a historical researcher. The stuff that's missing from the archives, the things that aren't mentioned, the letters that aren't there. If you remember from earlier, some of the maps that I showed a cluster of dots close to the Tower of London. That's actually where one of his brothers, Thomas, lived for a time on 10th Street when he was an ironmonger. At the time, the Tower of London contained quite a significant menagerie. There were tigers there, cheetahs there, all sorts of large, noisy mammals. Even if White never went in to visit the menagerie, and I can't imagine he could have stayed away, surely he must have noticed the sound of lions roaring while stood outside the Tower of London, but he never makes a single comment about it, which is possibly frustrating sometimes. You really would have thought he'd have made some sort of comment on that. I'm going to conclude on the hedgehog. It's one of my favourite non-flying mammals, I have to admit. I was hoping Hedgehog Hugh might have been in the audience today, but he's not here, so I'm going to have a word. But I know it's one that's close to the hearts of many mammalogists. Certainly on bat surveys, I find them a fantastic little companion, if somewhat noisy, and they could give a bit of warning occasionally, would be good. So here's the hedgehog. The hedgehog was, of course, for Gilbert White, a well-known mammal, so it's surprising what he picks out and what he doesn't talk about within these letters, what he finds worthy of talking to the famous naturalist Thomas Pennant about. Of course, it's well known, but it's also got strange folklore associated with it for its medieval propensity of carrying fruit around on its spines, a fashion fad which seems to have left our modern hedgehog, sadly. But one of the most endearing aspects of the hedgehog in the 18th century was the name it was given, the urchin, which I think is rather lovely. I'm not quite sure if it relates to the sea urchin and the sort of spiny nature of the sea urchin, just prickles. If anyone's got any clues on that, I'd love to hear them. White's letters here exemplify the difference in usage of information from the correspondence letters to Pennant to the published letters in the final book version. In the published version of the book, the hedgehog information is only contained within letter 27. But that letter is formed of 3 different letters. The hedgehog information has been extracted and put into one letter. So it's actually quite difficult to piece it against the original correspondence. It's somewhat out of the timeline's all a bit squiffy and a bit off. White describes within that letter, though, or indeed the original 3 letters, their method of eating, how they use their jaw when they're eating. He's obviously spending a lot of time really up close and watching what the hedgehog is doing. He talks about their value as pest control. But he also describes an event where he comes across a nest of young hedgehogs, only a few days old. He provides a detailed description, including consideration of the difficulties and adaptations of giving birth to spiky young. Despite the extensive commentary that he gives here on the species based on White's close observation and meticulous description, the description of the young of the hedgehog never actually makes it into an edition of Pennant's British Zoology. Much of White's comments on mammals do, however. The harvest mouse was revolutionary, requiring an entirely new entry in the fauna of Britain. While comments on bats, moose, and other mammals that we've mentioned today all add to Pennant's published text, whether attributed to White or not. He didn't always give credit where credit was due. In short, White's observations on mammals was foundational to our understanding of British species in the 18th century, as his records of species such as the swift, swallow, and nightjar, that he's arguably better known for. His attention to the wildlife around him, his passion for the natural world, and his enthusiasm for sharing his discoveries with his correspondents, his readers, and by default Pennant's readership, significantly enhanced 18th century understanding of mammals. Meanwhile, his methods of biological recording and popularity through the longevity of his wonderful writing has inspired naturalists for the last 250 years. Today, of course, we still record in much the same way as White, noting the who, what, where, and when of our observations of wildlife. Taken together, White's records, our own, and all of the records of the myriad of naturalists in the intervening years have enabled us to better understand our species and also their changing fortunes. Today, many of the mammal species White was referring to are under threat. As we certainly no longer see multitudes of harvest mice at harvest time, and the hedgehog bats have to be legally protected. But we can only understand these changes by looking at the extensive time series of records we have for our mammal species and the work of our forebears in natural history, such as White, and their endeavours certainly should not be forgotten within modern ecology and conservation. Thank you very much. Just to finally finish off, that's actually from the advert for the Natural History of Selborne. If the writer should have induced any of his readers to pay a more ready attention to the wonders of creation, or if he should, through his researches, have lent a helping hand towards the enhancement of the boundaries of knowledge, his purpose will be fully answered. And I think Gilbert White certainly did do that. Let's leave it on there, because if anyone does want to ask me any questions, then that's how to get hold of me. And the QR code takes you to all of my contact details if you need them. Any questions, anyone? I think we've got a bit of time. Yeah? Joanna, straight in there.
Thanks for a brilliant talk. I have a question maybe that's a bit broader. How is it that many early naturalists, or what we would now consider scientists, are linked to the church? So, you've got White, you've got Copernicus, you've got, I don't know, Gregor Mendel. Is it because a little bit of education was done in line with theology, and so this is coincidence, or is it a matter of funding, or if you were linked to the church, you kind of had a steady job, and so you could afford to have natural history hobbies on the side, or astronomy hobbies on the side? Do you know anything about that?
It's a great question. And I know a bit about it, but I'm actually going to direct you, if anyone really does want to delve into that question, a colleague of mine from the University of Northumbria, Professor Bricken Carey, is doing an excellent body of research specifically on the phenomenon of the clerical naturalist. I think he's up to about 8,000 naturalists on his list of clerical natural historians that he's found so far. So there's some brilliant work being done on that. I think there's a number of things, and they all sort of add up together. A big driver behind a lot of clerical people undertaking this study is, well, to quote Ray, to understand the wonders of creation. They're trying to understand the mind of God through what they perceive that their God has created. So it's very much that connection to God, that connection to the creation, trying to understand the order to nature to better understand the mind of God. It's that sort of theological approach to natural history. That notwithstanding, they are relatively well read, they are well connected, they have opportunity. And let's face it, a number of them are somewhat underemployed in terms of busyness. Not all parishes, of course, but some of them have quite a lot of time on their hands. Those that don't, of course, are still travelling. Quite a lot of people, this is before the sort of real sort of crackdown on pluralism. So you've got a lot of people taking curacies in multiple different areas, so they're travelling quite a lot. Gilbert was able to do many of his researches when he was on board Mouse and riding from home to various different curacies, some of which he held at the same time. So there's an opportunity there, there's a motivation there, and there's also the intellectual drive to know more about the world around them. Any other questions? Yes.
He didn't collect objects, did he? I mean, most of the things that he described were from nature or were things that were brought to him by people that had shot them or trapped them or whatever, but he didn't get taxidermists to preserve things that he thought were maybe worth.
He certainly didn't to the degree that a lot of naturalists were. He was an observer of behaviour, but he's not exclusively not killing things and not preserving things either. So he is doing some. There's very few likely candidates for surviving specimens from Gilbert White. I've been trying to look for them for many years. I've been rummaging around in various corners of the Natural History Museum. There must be one in here somewhere. There's a possible candidate at the Gilbert White Museum of a hawfinch, which might have been done by him. It uses a process for taxidermy, which he discusses in some of his letters. So he knew how to taxidermy, he did taxidermy himself, so he did do some. He didn't maintain a herbarium, like a lot of naturalists and botanists and, of course, medical men, of course, were doing. He was certainly a transporter of preserved specimens. So a lot of John White specimens from Gibraltar were collected in spirits and came through either Portsmouth or London to either the White brothers, Thomas and Benjamin, in London. Gilbert would have seen them, or they came from Portsmouth to Gilbert via the Alton stagecoach. So he was doing some. He was certainly passing some specimens to Pennant, but not a huge amount. Yeah.
You have Timothy.
We do, of course, have Timothy, but Timothy died after Gilbert. So Timothy, for those of you who don't know, Timothy is the female spur-thighed tortoise, which was Gilbert White's pet tortoise. Very lovely. She sits in Cabinet 12 in the Natural History Museum in our reptile gallery next to the doors to the library. And I've once got to hold her, and it was the most terrifying experience of my life because it creaks. Because the scoots on the bone, they all shift and move, and it creaks, and it's frightening. And I look like I'm smiling, and I'm not. Yes.
Do you think that White originally meant it to be published? Or was that, he wrote letters to Pennant and Barrington, but was it Pennant and Barrington who said, look, these are much more interesting, don't you think you ought to publish them? Who said he had actually several drafts after that?
Yes.
Or do you think he always intended them to be?
No, I don't think
it was Pennant and Barrington who stimulated.
Yeah, and I think it's particularly Barrington pushing. From what I've read of the conversations and from those opportunities of, well, okay, well, don't publish a whole thing on your own. Just do a letter to the Royal Society. Test the water, see what people think. I think a lot of it is Barrington encouraging him to publish. The opportunity being there because of his brother, other people that he might be meeting and talking to, going, oh, have you written this down anywhere? He certainly, the words that he uses to Barrington is, I should have thought of this 20 years ago if I was going to write a book on my own account. If I had done them, perhaps it should be a natural history of my local area. I'm paraphrasing terribly. But yeah, I should have started it 20 years ago. And I think it's probably then Barrington writing back to me, well, why don't you use the information you've written down? So it certainly wasn't the original intention. Yes.
Did he sort of recreate the letters from memory, or did he have a draft, or did he get the originals back?
He got the originals back. So the originals, there are 29 of them in the British Library to Thomas Pennant, and 14 of the letters to Barrington are also in the British Library. Some of them are in Harvard, some of them are in Oxford, so some of them are kind of scattered around. But the letters were all rewritten, handwritten out, and then you've got crossings through and renumberings and reorderings and various iterations of rewriting before you get to the final version as the final manuscript, which goes off to the publishers. So he recalled the letters. But I still find it incredibly strange and frustrating that he recalled the letters, but then never kept any of the replies. It's like listening to one side of a phone conversation. You had a question?
You talked about the harvest mouse as being a new mouse.
Yes.
And new to science, but obviously the farmers already knew all about it.
Absolutely.
In his original letters, does White talk about the kind of interactions of the people that he talks with animals, and what non-scientists know about the animals around them?
Yeah, he's certainly using a lot of local knowledge and the sort of countryman's knowledge. He seems to write in a way which creates quite a distinction between himself and his correspondence and the other sort of learned gentlemen and the sort of common sort of folk who are working on the land. But sometimes he refers to them by name. If he's referring to them by name, it's often in terms of the work that they're doing on the land. He refers by name more to nurserymen, where he's getting seeds from and plantsmen and things like that. Information like the quite famous one where a white rook has been seen and is then shot and nailed up to the side of a barn. Apologies for anyone who's not had the dinner yet. So he refers to that as like the Countryman's Museum, and it's just something that was done by the country people. So quite often you don't get them mentioned by name, but which obviously is a huge shame. But he's talking to a lot of people, and that's another advantage of being the village curate, as well as that you see everybody when they come to church, so you're having conversations. So if they find out you're interested, they bring you a thing along, like the otter that I mentioned as well. Yeah. Got a question at the back, young man over there. Outside the country? No, he was in contact with people who travelled outside the country. So his brother John lived in Gibraltar for 15, 16 years. So he was constantly talking to him. He met with and wrote to Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander, but he never really seems to have, from what I've read at least, he never seems to have had much communication. He doesn't seem to have talked very much to people outside of the UK. A lot of his correspondence would have done, and that's more how he got his information and knowledge. Great question. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's absolutely right. Great question. Thank you. Ooh, yes.
Thank you. We just wonder about the mammals that you didn't mention. I mean, badgers, foxes,
Yes.
deer, squirrels. Maybe there were lots of red squirrels running. Were they maybe because they were so common, or because?
Or he just had nothing to, he thought he could add in a conversation to Pennant.
Yeah.
I suppose he's talking about so much and he's trying to encapsulate within a couple of pages each time. And bear in mind, this is before you've got an envelope where you can stuff in loads and loads of information. You've got to keep it to a couple of sides of quite small paper. So what do you actually compress it down to? These letters are actually quite short. So he does mention Badger a little bit. He does pull in little snippets of information. He's clearly aware of them. But I think it's just a case of he didn't think he could add any information that was new about them. So he didn't bother. Yeah, yeah. Everything he knew about them was known. If you see what I mean. Oh, yep.
You referred to this mysterious cane.
Yes.
Have you got any idea on that? Whether it really existed, or what it could have been?
I don't. I have to admit I haven't devoted a huge amount of time to worrying about that particular bit. I don't at present. Does anyone else have any idea? I'm not sure that I... And it sounds to me, it sounds like a small weasel, but...
I was wondering, possibly a glistless, perhaps?
Red rather than greyish. And I think he's describing it as quite small. They're kind of quite chunky, aren't they? Yeah. I think he would have said chunky, well, because he's described it as like quite long and narrow. And, yeah. But again, he's picking up this information second or third hand. It's sort of, you know, a description I've heard of this extra one. And then himself says that maybe we look into it a bit more. But yeah, I've got to a bit of a dead end with that one, I'm afraid. But if anyone else has any ideas, I'm happy to hear them. Any more for any more? One last one? Well, Joanna is edging towards the shepherd's crook to drag me off the stage. I'm planning on going to the pub if anyone else is, so you can always grab me there.
I was about to say any last questions should be addressed in the pub, which is where Steph and Co will be heading. So thank you very much, Steph, for such a brilliant talk. Could we give our speaker one last round?